So let me begin by introducing our first speaker. Dr. Jihad Turk is president of the BAN Claremont Islamic Graduate School and former imam and director of religious affairs at the Islamic Center of Southern California. He's been here for a number of other events, and it's a great joy and pleasure to welcome him back again. So would you please come and speak to us? Welcome you.
Good evening. There's 3 people who are showing some love here. Appreciate it. So I was asked to speak about Muslim-Christian relations in times of fear, and I think Fuller thought, what a great way to test how we can relate to each other in times of fear. What a great way to do that by bringing someone with a scary name like Jihad to come and represent the Muslim perspective. Yes, that is my name, and I'll just say a quick word about that. My mom is Christian American from Oklahoma, and my father is Palestinian American from Jerusalem. So I say my mom's from the Midwest and my dad's from the Mideast. And so growing up I'm an American kid from Arizona, growing up in Phoenix with a name like Jihad in the 70s. I was born in 71. There wasn't a lot of diversity in Phoenix growing up at that time. And so with a name like Jihad, you were either black, white, or Mexican. People just thought it was an exotic Mexican name. But it was in my college years that I decided to go and explore my roots, both in Christianity and Islam. And that's where I found myself studying in seminary in places like Medina, in Saudi Arabia, and in Iran, and ultimately pursuing academia in institutions like Berkeley and Texas and now at UCLA, where I didn't quite get my doctoral degree yet, and I appreciate this is maybe an honorary doctorate that I had conferred on me this evening from Fuller, which would be a great honor, but still working on it. For all of you graduate students in the room, keep the hope. There's still light at the end of the tunnel. I wanted to say 3 things, and I think that used up all of my time, so thank you very much. Now, I wanted to say 3 things, really, in the few moments that I have with you here this evening. The first is that I think that relations between Muslims and Christians and people of other faith is something that is not only possible because of our scripture and because of our experiences as communities with each other throughout history, some highlights, if you will. But it is a mandate from the Muslim perspective that we have wonderful relations with peoples of other faith, particularly Christians and Jews, as those 2 communities are described in the Quran as peoples of the book, people of Scripture. And so I'll just share with you one verse that highlights this commandment by God in the Quran to have good relations with peoples of other faiths. There's a verse, and I'm going to summarize it for time's sake, that says simply that if God would have so willed, he could have made you a single people. He has given each of you a law and an open way. So your mandate now is to strive as if in a race in doing virtue with one another. In other words, encourage one another in doing good. Find that common ground upon which you can build a better tomorrow. In the end, you will all return to God, and he will tell you about the things in which you differed, our different theological positions, etc. So this is our commandment in the Quran, to work collaboratively and cooperatively with people of other faiths. I want to say something that might be counterintuitive, given the way that we consume information about other communities, religious communities in the media, that it's religion that is separating us. It's religion that is driving us apart. It's religion that is causing us to engage in conflict with one another and engage in violence. As a graduate student, one of the things that I wanted to pursue just for my own edification was the understanding of what's really going on in this part of the world. And having lived there and studied there and traveled extensively and studied extensively, it took me a number of years to come to the conclusion that I'm going to share with you this evening. And then I'll conclude with maybe an optimistic note. So the thesis that I want to share with you that I concluded was simply that despite being a person of faith who takes religion seriously and aspires to be influenced and informed in my conduct by my faith, it is my understanding and read of the world that most people in the world are motivated by things other than, considerations other than simply what does God expect from me. Things such as economics, culture, tribalism, and power. And so the thesis is, put simply, that what we find occurring in the world today, in places in which there is conflict and violence, is that most of these conflicts can be understood by looking through the lens not of religion, but in the lens of nation states, nationalist narratives, and competing nationalist narratives within boundaries of nation states. So let me give a few examples to unpack that thesis and give you examples both outside of the Muslim communities in the world and within the Muslim communities. And then we'll, as I indicated earlier, we'll conclude with some optimistic statements about what's going on here in the West and what could go on in other parts of the world. If we look at places, the world used to be divided into empires, in which they were characterized by being multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilinguistic, ruled by an emperor or a sultan in the case of the Ottoman Empire, that had all of this diversity under them, and their main focus was controlling the territory and extracting taxes from their population. But what you did in your personal life, as long as it wasn't rebellion, was not something that they interfered with too much. But once the world transitioned to a world of nation states, and starting with Europe, there were many wars that took place. And what it boiled down to in the case of Europe in particular, and then was exported to other parts of the world, was this coalescence around what it means to be not a subject of an empire, but a citizen within a nation state. And simply put, being a citizen within a nation state, and Foucault, some of you might have had to study him, would suggest that modern nationalism centers around 5 main aspects of identity. One of them is religion, but the other ones include language, attachment to a particular piece of land, a shared history, and a culture. And so if we look at the conflicts around the world, what you have are, within nation states, competing nationalist narratives where one or more of these identity markers are disparate, they're separate amongst competing groups for power of the state. And so if we take the well-known case of Northern Ireland, we have here, they're all Irish, they speak the same language, the same culture, the same history, the same piece of land. What's the differentiation between the two groups was religion. One was Catholic, one was Protestant. It's not that there's anything inherent within Catholicism that would justify the terrorism that the IRA undertook to pursue their political ends. Nonetheless, this tactic was used in order for that group to gain political power. And it wasn't so much a religiously justifiable, not that you can justify any of the tactics that were used that involved violence from a Christian or Catholic point of view, but it was a nationalist struggle in which religion was one of the identity markers for that group. Similarly, in the case of the Basques in northern Spain, in the Pyrenees area of the Iberian Peninsula, they were struggling for an independent state, an independent country. And they used terrorism tactics, blowing up public facilities and killing civilians as a way to try and achieve their goal. A few years ago, they finally gave up their decades-long struggle for independence. What was the distinguishing narrative within the the Iberian Peninsula for this group, this demographic, to pursue their nationalist interest was, or their self-autonomy, their self-governance, was that they were all Catholic. The rest of the Spaniards, as well as those who lived in the area where the Basques wanted to claim independence, but they were different in all the other 4 areas. They had their own culture, their own language, their own history, and their own territory. Similarly, you can take another example, and I'm about to wrap up. I realize I'm coming to the end of my remarks now, but we're going to get to the Muslim world, and I think that there was some political violence that happened there, if I'm not mistaken, in recent years. But one more case study from outside the Muslim tradition, and this one might be a little bit more surprising to you. If I were to mention to you Buddhism, your first impression might be, Buddhism equals peace and love and gentleness. Recently, I hosted a delegation at Bayan Claremont that the State Department sent over from this region within this country that used to be called Burma, now we call Myanmar, in which Buddhist monks are espousing a radical ultra-nationalist narrative and encouraging their followers who are heeding them and actually going out and following at their behest, a slaughter of a minority Muslim community known as the Rohingya Muslims. And it seems counterintuitive because it's not really what Buddhism is about. But Buddhism was being instrumentalized by the newly democratic state of Myanmar to instill fear in a certain population, to unify other parts of the population for political purposes. And so if we take the same unifying lens by which we can perceive most of the world's conflicts today and apply it to the Muslim world, it starts to make a little bit more sense what's going on there. And I wanted to emphasize this point because the theme of the talk is Muslim-Christian relations in times of fear. Really I would retitle it as Muslim-Christian relations in times of political instability, because it's in times in which there is contested political authority that one group forms a tribalist attitude or mentality and then goes after, using oftentimes in unstable parts of the world, political violence. And in more stable societies, elevated rhetoric, and we see some of that going on, not just here in the United States, but we see that ultra-nationalist rhetoric going on with UKIP in England or the Le Pen party in France and other the resurgence of skinheads in Germany, etc. But let's take Iraq, for example. So in the case of Iraq, we have, if you were to follow the headlines, you would know that there are three groups primarily fighting. You have the Shiites, the Sunnis, and the Kurds. So we know that the Shiites are Shiite Muslim, and the Sunnis are Sunni Muslim. What religion are the Kurds? Well, the news media doesn't highlight or emphasize their religious affiliation because it doesn't fit into the narrative. And they don't quite know what to do with the Kurds because they are the same religious denomination as the Sunnis. They're the Sunni Arabs. They're simply Sunni Kurds. But you don't hear them referred to as Sunni Kurds versus Sunni Arabs versus Shiite Arabs. Maybe it doesn't fit into the soundbite. But what we have going on in Iraq was a place of political instability in which that transitioned to a democracy, and the majority of that population being Shiite, took control of the apparatus of the state and then persecuted some of the minorities. The Kurds want their independence. The Arabs, the Sunni Arabs, also wanted a sense of independence, and so there was this tribalization, in this time of what we would say identity politics, that was then fueled on in its rhetoric, not just political rhetoric, but with military arms, with regional powers of Saudi Arabia and Iran then supporting various sides, and then Turkey gets in the mix, and the Kurds want their independence. So you have a nationalist struggle in the province of what is Iraq because you have particularly three nationalist groups. Who gets the raw end of the deal? Well, in the case of Iraq, it's been those who are disempowered, the religious minorities in particular, whether it's the Yazidis or the Christians. And this is not Islamically justifiable. This is something that's abhorrent to any person of religion, the treatment of those communities. I will say that now the Sunni Arab region that has been conquered by ISIS, they're employing these techniques in part because, and I was at the White House Summit on Countering Violent Extremism a year ago in February, and I had the opportunity to talk to the intelligence community officials at that time and said, what's going on with the social media messaging that they have and trying to recruit people from the West and from other parts of the Muslim world, they said, well, they're using this media to project power that they don't otherwise have, and also to try and undermine the strength of the coalition that's formed against them. So, they have an agenda with what they're doing in their messaging. My point is simply this. They're using media to communicate spectacular, gruesome acts of savagery to project power, and they claim religion in the process, but really what's motivating them is not religion. In fact, what they're doing is antithetical to the teachings of Islam, to the point that even Al-Qaeda calls them out as being un-Islamic. And when Al-Qaeda calls you out as being un-Islamic and too extreme, you're on thin ice there. And so, the number one question that we always get as Muslims who speak publicly is, where are the Muslims condemning what's going on in this part of the world? And my response is, ask Google. It's all there. We've been condemning, I would say the largest Muslim organization recently came out with a very long condemnation of ISIS, but you might be surprised to know where that largest Muslim organization in the world is. It's in Indonesia with Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU. So you can Google NU and their condemnation of ISIS, but every major Muslim scholar has come out on this issue. So my point is, relating it back to the topic and in conclusion, is simply this. The problem of Muslim-Christian relations is not a problem of our theology. Yes, we have different theologies. Yes, we can discuss our understanding of God and the way that we view Jesus and other important matters about salvation and morality and our values. And we have areas of commonality and areas of significant difference. But these differences should not, and in many times, and I would even argue most times throughout Islamic history, have not led to political violence, or not led to violence against that has been communal or sectarian in nature, unless there is political instability, during which times we tend to, as people, become tribal in our thinking and decide who's our group and who's the other group, and then it can turn sour. By way of hope, I'll just suggest this. As Muslim Americans, we have felt a little bit misunderstood in recent years, particularly after 9/11, and a little bit besieged in the Western context, and America in particular, particularly around not violent acts abroad or even domestically, but around election cycles. And the ISPU, which is a research firm, has actually done an analysis of when there has been spikes in anti-Muslim hate crimes and hate incidents, and they correspond precisely to election cycles. But on a positive note, as I was saying, last October I was invited to participate in a signing of a pledge between evangelical pastors and imams in Washington, D.C. at the National Cathedral. And that pledge, before that pledge, we had a dinner together, and an evangelical research firm admitted at that time, having surveyed evangelical pastors, that general Islamophobia in the United States is at a certain level that's quite high. Evangelical pastors, it's kind of off the scale on many points. And it was kind of a mea culpa moment where they said, listen, it's not very Christian of us to be so anti-Muslim in our rhetoric. We need to be more Jesus-like and be more Christian in our treatment of Muslims. Plus, we want to convert you, and we're not going to be very successful in doing so if we're turning you away. Bob Roberts actually said that, but only half joking, if at all. And he said, well, you probably want to convert us too, but let us agree to not vilify one another, and let us also pledge to pursue issues of religious freedom. And so we all signed this document with enthusiasm, and we look forward to the possibility of partnering with Christian communities across the spectrum, but particularly within the evangelical communities, motivated out of a firm conviction in our faith and a sense of, yes, these are scary times of what's going on in the world and potentially here at home, but as peoples of faith, we can not only love God with all of our hearts, but we can love our neighbors and one another and build together on that common foundation of our values and our commitment to God and faith, a better society here at home and hopefully around the world. I thank you very much for your attention, and may God's peace be with all of you.